True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on. On a quiet street in Sydney in 2001, 20-year-old Sef Gonzales would return to his family home to find his father, mother and sister all dead, stabbed, beaten and strangled. In his panicked call to 000, he would mistakenly believe that they'd all been shot. There was so much blood at the scene, he couldn't initially tell what had really happened to his family. What actually occurred in the Gonzalez family home that day would be followed by a nearly year-long investigation that would see accusations of dodgy business deals, hitmen, gangland retaliation, bribery, revenge, and poison. But while this sounds like the plotline for a season of Underbelly, in reality, the truth about the Gonzalez family murders was much simpler, much more sinister, and much closer to home. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. When New South Wales Police stepped into the investigation into the murder of Teddy Gonzalez, his wife Loiva and daughter Clodine in the Sydney suburb of North Ryde in July 2001, they would find the only surviving family member, Sef, seemingly devastated over the brutal deaths of his father, mother and sister. He'd been out with a friend on the night his family died, captured on CCTV footage out at dinner and then at an arcade playing video games. He arrived home to the confrontational scene, telling police that he'd try to revive them using CPR. He said he also tended to the wounds on his sister's body, but why was there only a tiny bit of blood on his clothing? Sef also said that he wasn't home that afternoon, but why was his distinct green Ford Fiesta in the driveway? Who were the men Sef had seen running from the house, and was the racist graffiti on a wall inside the home the real reason his family was targeted? With all these questions adding up, investigators had to unravel the Gonzalez family murders with a nearly 12 months investigation, using tactics that would normally be used in organised crime investigations. So what did the undercover operatives and bugged phones discover? And why would one statement from Sef make his auntie finally realise what went down that day? Nick Kaldas has had a long career with the New South Wales Police. Arriving from Egypt as a child, he would grow up wanting to be a police officer. At age 21, that became his reality, working as a hostage negotiator and an undercover cop, before becoming one of the most senior officers here in Australia as the New South Wales Deputy Commissioner. During his time on the force, he led some of New South Wales's biggest criminal investigations, from the murder of MP John Newman to the disappearance of Samantha Knight. He would also oversee the investigation into the murder of the Gonzalez family. Could the baby-faced surviving member of the Gonzalez family really have killed his entire family? He sat down with us to remember his time on the force and explain how they finally caught the real killer of Teddy, Loiva and Clodine Gonzalez. So you joined the New South Wales Police at the tender age of 24, but you've grown up on the force during what would be quite a tumultuous time for New South Wales Police. There's been a fair bit of scandal, which we've seen play out on TV shows across Australia in recent years. What was it like for you as a young officer being surrounded by that?
I wouldn't say I was surrounded by controversy or corruption. I think by and large, I think probably 90-something% of police in New South Wales went about their work and were doing a good job. But there was a minority, obviously, that was up to no good, and that all came out later on. But I don't think it was visible to anyone. I mean, and people who are doing bad things, corrupt things, don't discuss it. It's not something that comes out on a daily basis in the meal room.
So they're not sitting in the lunchroom going, hey, how's about this bribe I just received? No?
No. I mean, those who are up to no good would talk to others who are up to no good. But my strong sense and belief is that it was a very small minority, but they obviously tainted everybody else with that stench.
Can you tell me how one ends up as a hostage negotiator?
Sure. You have to apply, obviously. You have to have a certain number of years, and I can't remember, but you certainly have to have experience as a police officer before they take you. In the metropolitan area, they tend to go for detectives because detectives are not if you're in uniform, you have a shift and you're on the truck, and if an incident happens and you get taken off the truck, obviously you've got a shortage in staff then on that shift. But detectives, you can put off whatever statements you're taking or interviews you're doing or whatever, and go to a siege or whatever incident has occurred. So they tend to gravitate towards detectives. In the country, they tend to they're not as fussy. You have to apply. You have to have people who will give you references to say this person is a good communicator. He connects with people well and so on. So you're a detective, you have the time, and then you have to go through a fairly strenuous selection process. In particular, it includes a lot of psychological testing to make sure that you're not someone who's going to fly off the handle. And the motto is that if you can't control yourself, how are you going to control anyone else? So you go through a 2-week course, and you can fail, but if you pass, you go on a team, and there's a team of 4 for the negotiators, and it's pretty much a way across the Western world, the English-speaking world at least. There's a team of 4 usually, so there's a team leader, the primary negotiator who does all the talking, the secondary who sticks with and backs up and takes notes for the primary, and then the gopher, as they call it, which is the starting point. If you come on a team, you usually start as a gopher. You get the coffee, you go back and forth between the team leader and so on and the negotiators. And then eventually you go from gopher to secondary to first, and then if you're lucky, you get the team leader. I was lucky, I got the team leader, but I had a lot of years as a primary, which is good. The other thing is you're not on call all the time, because that would obviously be draining. So there's usually 5 or 6, and I think there's more now, teams. And so every 5th or 6th week, your team is on call for that week, and you have to be on standby. In those days, we had pagers. I don't know whether young kids today know what pagers are, but
I think maybe drug dealers do, but not so many just average people know.
But your pager would go off, contact the duty operations inspector, and you'd get writing instructions from wherever you are about where you are. And then it's blue lights and siren to get to a siege or whatever it is that they need you to go to.
We are going to focus in on the Gonzalez murders shortly, but other than that case, what are some of the other high-profile cases that you ended up working on in New South Wales?
Gosh, there's quite a few. So I had about a dozen years in the homicide squad. In the last 4 or so, I was actually the commander. And I'll just clarify that I was not the officer in charge of the Gonzalez case. I was the commander of the homicide squad and therefore was briefed and consulted, and we discussed the lines of investigation and so on. The officer in charge, who did a very good job, was a detective sergeant at that stage. He's now chief superintendent, Mick Sheehy, who's legendary homicide detective. He's done a lot of really good work. Some of the other cases, probably the most prominent one that sticks out in my mind is the murder of John Newman, the Member of Parliament in 1994. I started off as one of the team on it, but then eventually, a short time later, I became the commander of it, and I stuck with it, obviously, after that. And it was a 7-year investigation between murder and conviction, and it's been torturous, I have to say. So essentially, John Newman was killed by a political opponent who's now been convicted and sentenced to life, never to be released, a fellow called Fung Can No. We had a series of hearings at the Crime Commission where we grilled people, basically. He had approached a number of criminal groups to do the murder who had rejected the offer.
So essentially like looking for hitmen.
Yeah. And we managed to get those people who were approached, who had rejected and not done anything, to roll, as they say, and actually tell us what happened and then give evidence of that later on. We tracked his movements on the mobile phone. We were probably one of the first cases to investigate using mobile phone data.
In the 90s?
1994. It was,
right.
It was revolutionary. And we proved that he was at the scene of the murder at the time of the murder, and then later on he goes to Voyager Point footbridge in Georges River, and he makes a number of calls from there in an attempt to alibi himself after the murder, and drops the gun into the river. We dredged the river sometime later and found the gun, and it was matched ballistically. We had the hearings at the Crime Commission, then we had a coroner's inquest because the DPP didn't feel we had enough to charge. And then we had a committal hearing, then we had 3 Supreme Court trials. One was aborted, one was a hung jury, 11-1, and the third time he was convicted. The other guys involved were acquitted. But that was a hard-fought one. It was very much under the intense glare of media and public attention.
You would think after you leave the New South Wales Police Force, you would live a much quieter, sedate life, but that seems that is not in your DNA because you've done so many things. You've led investigations into chemical weapons use in Syria. You did an independent review of the Christchurch shootings. How do you think these roles after leaving the police force have shaped you and that whole perspective on global justice and accountability?
I don't know. It's for others to judge, but I had a bit of a policy, if you like, that if something came up and I thought it was worthwhile, I found it difficult to say no. I probably was not ready, and I'm probably not quite ready yet, to sit at home in my pajamas. I may get to that, but I'm not there yet. And obviously the thing that took up 3 years of my life was the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, which was, I think, it was certainly a noble cause, and I'm honoured that I was asked to serve in that role. But a lot of the roles you've said, and I was also the Director of Internal Oversight in UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which is the United Nations agency that deals with all the Palestine refugee issues in 5 countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Gaza and the West Bank. And I had officers and staff in each of the locations, and we lived in Jordan for 3 years, headquarters while I carried that out. If something comes up and I think I can do some good in it and I'm not going to stuff it up, you know, like most cops, I operate on the basis of bite off more than you can chew and chew like hell.
Mm-hmm. Which then leads you to write an entire book on top of all of that too. So you still have not sat still for a minute, have you?
Not quite, no. The book was a torturous process as well, Claire, I have to say. I've not done this before. I'm certainly not an author. There's a few things that sort of convinced me to do it. One is encouragement from friends, and in particular Gary Jubilant. He's written a couple of books himself, and we worked together in homicide for many, many years. But the other fellow who sort of convinced me to do this is a fellow called Bob Baer. It's B-A-E-R. He's an American fellow, ex-CIA. He was in the CIA guy in Lebanon throughout the Lebanese Civil War. He's certainly got some stories to tell. So he wrote his book. It's called The Company We Keep. In America, they tend to refer colloquially to the CIA as the company. And it's a really good book, The Company We Keep. He dedicated his book to his kids, and he opens the book up by saying, I hope this goes some way towards explaining where the hell I was. And he said to me, you don't do it for yourself sometimes. You do it for your family, your kids, grandkids, great-grandkids. I mean, we've been on a bit of a journey out of Upper Egypt in the south to Cairo, and then from Cairo to Sydney, and then for me, I've gone to a lot of other places, obviously. And I felt it would be good to have a record of that for the family and for the kids and for my community, the Egyptian community, the Coptic community, the Arabic community, the migrant community in Australia. I've done my best to be a somewhat positive role model. And I used to try and attend all the recruitment days, particularly in southwest Sydney, where we talked to the communities. Not that I was sort of Exhibit A, but they would say, look, here is someone who's just a kid from Marrickville.
Yeah. And look at this migrant boy. Look what he's achieved. Yeah.
If I can do it, I'm very ordinary. So if I can do it, I think anyone can.
Yeah.
And that was my message. You know, you can do this. There should be no glass ceilings. I'm happy to have broken through a couple of glass ceilings, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not a judge. And I'm maybe the first one to head up a federal royal commission without being a lawyer. My 2 co-commissioners, one was a Supreme Court judge, former Supreme Court judge, James Douglas, and the other one was a psychiatrist and former CEO of the National Mental Health Commission. So I think the 3 of us brought really good perspectives to that problem, and it worked quite well.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with former Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales Police Force, Nick Kaldas. Up next, Nick tells us about the Gonzalez family murders and how Sef Gonzales reported his family's death to police. Well, let's talk about the Gonzalez murders and look at the Gonzalez family themselves. What do we know about their lives and who they were before they immigrated to Australia from the Philippines?
They're a religious family. They were Catholic, quite law-abiding and hard-working. Mum and dad and the daughter, obviously, and the son. And somewhere along the line, and I'm not a psychologist, but the son, obviously, Sef, lost his way emotionally or ethically, morally. You know, to kill your own family because you want the inheritance is pretty bad. But he was failing at, and there were very high expectations, I think, as most migrant families experience. His dad had very high expectations, expected him to go to uni and to study and to do all these things, which he simply wasn't up to doing. And he couldn't, in my view, he couldn't admit that. So the answer was he wanted the lifestyle and the car and the house and the money and whatever. And this thing stood in his way with his father insisting that he actually do well at studying and graduating and so on. So he took the ultimate step of killing them.
Well, let's talk about that family dynamic for a moment, because they did immigrate after a major earthquake in the Philippines destroyed Dad's business, and apparently Sef was pulled from the rubble by his dad, Teddy, so he saved his life back then, which is ironic seeing as he would take his life later. But you're right, Sef started a medical degree, failed it, then shifted to law, and from what his parents thought at the time, he was actually doing remarkably well. He joined the family firm as a paralegal and IT specialist. So for a while there looked like things were going really well. But then it seems the wheels were starting to fall off because Sef wanted to be a musician. He was in a boy band that played at some nightclubs, etc. He'd gotten a girlfriend, and I'm guessing that family dynamic, as you mentioned, which does run through quite a lot of migrant families, is a real high expectation that you'll be academic and that you will deliver a really satisfying career result as a result of that academic.
Yeah.
Was that what we think? I mean, he said he did this for the inheritance, but was that the beginning of where the wheels started to fall off, that pressure on him to become something that he didn't want to be?
And he was failing. He knew and he was never going to be able to live up to. I don't think he was ever going to finish and graduate and whatever. He simply wasn't up to it.
How did he then make his parents think he was being successful?
Well, he didn't tell them where he was and what he was doing, basically. There's an old story, actually, which probably illustrates the point you're making among migrant communities. A fellow called Rami Malek, who's an actor, he played Freddie Mercury in the movie about Queen. He's Egyptian, like me, and he won the Best Actor Oscar Award. So he rang his mum, allegedly, and said to her, "Mum, I've won the Best Actor Oscar Award." And she said to him, "That's nice, son, but you're not a doctor." So that's the expectation that...
Yeah.
If you're not a doctor, you're sort of, I'm a bit of a failure in many ways.
Right.
But I think reality sort of was surrounding him and haunting him, and he got to a point where he simply would have had to admit to his father and family at some stage that I'm failing. I'm not going to do what you think I'm up to. And he didn't know how they'd take that. They'd probably disown him and whatever. And so his answer was to not confront the problem and talk to them about it. It was to kill them. Now, how he went from that to killing his parents and sister and so on, I really don't know. I can't comprehend that mentality of going to that really extreme, horrible, evil conclusion. But he certainly did that.
Well, let's talk about the crime itself. It's the 10th of July, 2001. So Teddy, his dad, Loiva, mum, have gone off to work in separate cars. His sister Clodine is home from school for school holidays. She's been shifted down to Melbourne because in this strict parenting style that they have, she got a boyfriend in Sydney, so they shifted her away to live somewhere else in order for her to focus on her studies, right?
Yeah.
So she's back. She's a couple of days away from returning to Melbourne, so she's getting some study and she stayed at home. What do we know of Sef's movements, or what Sef said his movements were that day?
There were a lot of inconsistencies in what he said, which were proven in the evidence and produced in court. And it was one of the things that brought him undone, is that he lied. He tried to change his version a number of times, and it just got worse and worse for him. He could not account for his whereabouts at the time of the murder, and there were neighbours who had seen the car in the driveway and so on. I can't recall the exact details, but I do recall that it was a critical factor in the case against him. Lying is never good for someone who's accused of murder. Being caught out is obviously very bad. And then when you put your foot in it further and create, concoct more lies that you're caught out about. And there were records of his movement through entry into buildings and other things that were produced as well. It was a very thorough, methodical sort of gathering and timeline that was put together by Mick Sheehy and his team. And ultimately the jury was convinced that they were right.
So Loiva's sister is supporting her nephew through this. She thinks that he's, devastated by the murder of his family members. So she's sitting with him while he's being interviewed by police. And he said that he had popped home, but he'd sat in the car in the driveway because it was raining at around 6 p.m. And she recalls snatching her hand away from him because in that moment she realises that he's lying because she had gone to the house at 6 p.m. and she knew full well it wasn't raining. And she had seen his car in the driveway and knew that he wasn't in it. But police realise that she realises that he's lying, and then they recruit her to try and get his confession.
Yeah.
That's really clever. Did that work though?
Oh, to some extent it did. He told her things that he probably didn't mean to and particularly didn't want the police to sort of hear. But it's that human dynamic where you see, and the Lynn family murders was the other case where a lot of people stuck with the offender thinking the poor guy, he's lost his loved ones, we've got to try and support him and what have you. And you might recall that famous moment was Sef Gonzales sang a hymn at the funeral for his parents, and there wasn't a dry eye.
He sang the Mariah Carey song, didn't he?
He did,
One
yeah.
Fine Day or something, if I remember rightly.
There wasn't a dry eye in the house. It was this terrible story about this kid who'd lost his family, and we must all feel sorry for him, which makes it even more evil, I have to say. I mean, to do something as horrible as that and then soak up the adulation and sympathy is in itself pretty bad. Yeah.
What was interesting too is police said that they kind of knew from the 000 call onwards that something wasn't right with Sef, because while he seemed to be very distraught and he seemed to be sobbing when they arrived at the scene, he wasn't actually crying, and he gave very clear answers to directives and questions. Is that a bit of a giveaway when someone is a little bit too on the ball?
Yeah, and my memory is that there were no tears. But I think, call it the gut feeling, and certainly most homicide investigators would have this. Within the first few hours, you tend to get a bit of a gut feeling, and my belief is that it's usually right. Sometimes it's wrong, it's not 100%, but I know in the Newman murder, literally within a few hours, we were thinking the murderer was our man. In that one, we had 97 lines of inquiry and we had to eliminate all of them before we could charge anyone, which we did. But you eventually land on the one, and certainly in the Sef Gonzales murder, they very quickly landed on a belief that he, one, was not being truthful. The body language is really important, non-verbal communications, inconsistencies in the stories, lies that were able to be proved as lies, deliberate lies that couldn't possibly be a mistake, and quite a large number of those. And then if you add all that up together, it becomes a very compelling circumstantial case.
They did have to rule out some other lines of inquiry, though, because there is the potential racial hate crime because of the graffiti. There was also a lot of conversation about Teddy's business. He worked as a lawyer helping Filipino immigrants come into Australia and do their documentation, and he had been charged with falsifying some documents. He was later cleared of that, but there was this phone call that a colleague overheard that he was arguing with somebody back in the Philippines over some property and that there was a threat to kill his family. So there was a lot of other lines of inquiry that were followed. Sef wasn't the only one, right?
No. And to be fair, in any murder investigation, you absolutely have to follow all those other lines of inquiries to the nth degree and rule them out. Because if you don't, they will be brought up in court and the defence will say, you haven't done your job, there are other possibilities, our client is innocent, etc. So it's really crucial in any murder investigation to actually listen to and follow up on any other possibility, really, other than the person you ultimately charge, to make sure that there is nothing there. And certainly that was the case in the Sef Gonzales case.
Can we talk about the injuries to the victims? Because it's interesting when you look at the three different victims. So Clodine, his younger sister, was the first to be killed. What do we know about her death?
I think it was quite horrible, obviously. I mean, this might be distressing for some of the listeners, but I wasn't at the scene, but I'm told there are metal grids that police use in a crime scene that are off the ground, lifted off the ground about 4 or 5 inches. And there was so much blood, both with Claudine's murder and the parents' murder, that they had to put a number of those to step on so they don't disturb the scene until it's photographed and captured fully. There's a huge amount of blood everywhere, really. And sorry to digress slightly, but one of the things I and the senior police really have to worry about in these sorts of cases is the mental health and well-being of the homicide investigator, seeing the worst of humanity in that sort of situation, which I think we do reasonably well now. I'm not going to say it was perfect always, but it certainly is now. But one of the things that I was briefed on is the sheer quantity of blood that had been spilled, both in Claudine's murder and the parents' murder. There's quite savage stabbing.
She was also hit with some kind of blunt object too.
Yep. Yeah.
And strangled. Like, that feels very personal.
Yeah, and I think there's some evidence given at the time about the mode, if you like, the method of operation and how savage it was. I honestly can't explain that. I can't rationalise it for someone to do that to their sister. I know there's a move at the moment by those who support Sef Gonzales to have him released. I think those who are thinking of that need to look at what you've just said and the savagery that had occurred in that house before they support someone like him.
In Clodine's case, there was this theory that she had found out that he was falsifying his university records and had maybe dobbed him in to his parents, which is why there was a motive here potentially for him to be so savage towards her. Do you remember if that was ever proven?
No, it wasn't proven, but that was certainly a very strong suspicion that police held. And unless he begins to tell the truth, which will never happen, I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of that. But that is the logical conclusion from everything we've heard.
Let's talk about the deaths of Teddy and Loiva, because in Loiva's case, police in the autopsy report found neck wounds from a knife that were done post-mortem, which suggests that her killer stabbed so many times he kept going even after she was dead. Like, what does that tell you about somebody when they just are obviously full of so much rage that they don't even stop when their victim is dead?
I think we'll never know, but my belief is that he wanted to make sure that the job was done. He didn't want to take any chance that they may recover. It's truly savage. On any level, but let alone with a loved one, to do that to a loved one.
There did seem to be some kind of attempt to make it look like a burglary. Like there were some things placed around, some wardrobes opened. But police did notice that the house was pretty impeccable. Other than those bits, would it have been for police like super obvious that this was not a robbery?
I think, I wouldn't say super obvious, but it was certainly a conclusion that you would reach once you examined the house properly and worked out. It was sort of an attempt to lead police to thinking that it was a racist attack. It doesn't quite fit in with a robbery. They're two separate sort of sets of motivations. If you're a racist, you're not going to be there for monetary gain. And if you're there for monetary gain, you're not going to scrawl all that stuff on the walls calling them names. So it was incongruous, really. It didn't fit. It just didn't fit, as was most things in that case.
Well, another thing that doesn't fit, which police reenacted, was Sef did say that he saw someone that night run away from the house, one, maybe two men. But what's interesting is how much detail police have to go into in reenacting what a suspect tells them happened, because they actually stepped through everything that he told them and found out that it just was not physically possible for him to have gotten downstairs, opened a roller door, got out onto the road and seen someone run off, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But reenactments are really important, and usually they're filmed so that they can be shown to a jury or a judge later on, obviously. But again, it was just these really significant inconsistencies in what he was saying, and the fact that you could prove that it's not right, what he's saying is not right, and then the logical conclusion is it's not an accident, it's not a mistake. This is a deliberate lie in an attempt to lead police in a different direction to reality.
There's also a couple of other bits that no one could quite explain, although Sef did try to explain them, which is why, because he said he went in and attempted CPR on his family members and he tried to tend to his sister's wounds, but he had very little blood on him. And as you mentioned, like police had to put in measures to make sure they didn't contaminate the scene due to the sheer amount of blood at the scene. And also he had a tiny blue stain on his jumper, which suspiciously matched the shade of blue that racist graffiti was sprayed on. He then mentions that it was raining, so the rain would have washed the blood away. Like, how do investigators in that moment, noticing these inconsistencies and then hearing those explanations, not kind of roll their eyes and say, like, sure, mate? Like, how do you handle that and still try and get him to reveal himself? The
thing is, when you know you're being fed a line and it's not true, the worst thing you can do is to roll your eyes or sort of lose control or whatever. Obviously, the professionalism kicks in, but you would continue to probe in an effort to get them to say, and that's what happens usually. I think that's what happened with Sef. He was lying about things, and when he got caught out on things, he dug himself deeper and deeper into a hole. And that's really, when police are interviewing, the ideal situation, if you have a transcript of the interview, which is recorded, You would have one or two lines from the investigator asking questions, and then a big piece or big chunk from the suspect who's answering the questions. What you don't want is for the investigator to be doing most of the talking. You want to draw them out. You want them to do the most of the talking. You want them to, not dig a hole for themselves. If they're telling the truth, then there would be no problem. But the idea is not to roll your eyes or act cynical, is to simply plough on and get them to keep talking.
With Sef, was it harder to grasp that he could have done this just from the way he looks? And we talk about this with victims a lot of the time, that there is this idea of the perfect victim, how they look and how they react and how they act in those times of stressful situations. But in Sef's case, he was in his 20s, but he looked about 12. He looked really, really young, such a baby face. He looked really innocent. Was it hard to look at him like a potential suspect when he looked like a little boy?
Look, I can't speak for the investigators, but I think I certainly thought, geez, where did this go wrong? Where did this kid go wrong? And he clearly had gone wrong. And then as time went by and the evidence mounted, I think they just accepted that this is what happened, that he had this evil streak in him, obviously, and he had done this terrible thing. You have to put your personal feelings aside sometimes. I mean, I've seen murder cases where the police may have some sympathy for the murder of domestic violence, for instance, where the victim may eventually lash out and do something to the offender, to the person that's hurting them. You have sympathy, but you can't let it stop you from doing, and you can't let that thinking hold you up. You've got to do what you've got to do.
After the break, Nick reveals how investigators began to catch on to Sef's lies, ultimately leading to his unravelling. Stay with us. Do you remember what police uncovered when they started speaking to Sef's sort of extended circle, his friends and colleagues? Because there were some wild claims made by him as to sort of what he did for a living and who he was in the world. Do you remember some of the things he was telling people?
Yeah, I do recall that he lived a sort of fantasy life, if you like, where he bragged about things and claimed things that simply weren't true. And all of that came back to haunt him, obviously, once the police started interviewing all his associates and fellow students and all of that sort of stuff. It's yet another motive, in my view, that he had said all these things to people, and if he had not completed uni, dropped out because he was failing and got cut off by the family in some way, it would have all sort of collapsed around him. One of the things that I think he would have wanted to achieve with the murders is to have this instant sympathy and empathy from all his associates, friends, family, and so on, and that they would not be questioning about some of the crap he said and dished out. I don't recall much about what he actually said, but I do remember that once the police came back from some of these interviews, they just said he's lived I can't think of the character in that movie where it's all basically a facade and lies.
What's really interesting, and I want to get your take on this, is how he may have tried to plan this murder before that day, because there was quite a few finds in his internet search history to do with dangerous plants. There was a vial of liquid found taped underneath a desk, and a suspicious case of food poisoning that his mum had experienced that did land her in hospital for a couple of days.
Yeah.
Was that used as evidence in court, the fact that he'd actually planned to do this another way previously?
Yes. What it showed, that's absolutely right. And what it did show is that he was exploring ways of doing it without getting caught. I don't think your listeners would, I'm sure they would appreciate the fact that even if you wipe the search history off your laptop, it's still there.
There you go, criminals. Make sure you know that.
I think everyone knows that. I mean, you can't, this is the thing. Technology now is so pervasive, there's almost no privacy. So what you do is usually, you can dig it up again later on if the right authorities come in and they can dig it up later on.
So even back in 2001, that was still a possibility.
Yeah, definitely. But the thing is, it is a fairly key finding that he was exploring ways to kill people. And then this happens, obviously. Well, the only conclusion that can be drawn is that he was exploring ways to do it in a way where he wouldn't get caught if it was done, by stealth. It didn't work out for him, obviously, and he resorted to the more physical approach. But it certainly was very much a part of the evidence against him.
When police made it quite clear that Sef's alibi wasn't legit, he did claim that he'd driven to find a friend who just moved to Kingsgrove but didn't know his address and only realised that when he got there, and so drove around Kingsgrove for a bit before he came back to meet his friend to go out for dinner at Planet Hollywood. That he just kind of came up with another alibi and floated that with police about visiting a sex worker via taxi, and that kind of explained away why his car was in the driveway at the time when his aunt had popped around. Like, what do you do when someone comes back and says, oh, by the way, that alibi isn't right, this is the real one?
You make sure you record it and get them to commit to it. So it's not just him telling them. It had to have been recorded in a proper interview, and then each version that he gave that proved to be untrue is yet another nail in the coffin. So you need to get them to say it, document the fact that they've said it and how they said it and when they said it and where they said it and so on, and then go about proving that that version is also not true. And again, it's just another nail in the coffin, unfortunately, for him.
It's funny because he did try and bribe a taxi driver, but it's pretty easy to find out where a taxi driver has been on any given day and time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Look, he wasn't a criminal genius. I think a lot of what he did was silly, really. Or probably immature, it might be the right word. I'm not sure. I mean, if he was a grown man, I don't know that he would have done some of these silly things and thinking that he was going to pull the wool over the police eyes and so on. But look, at the end of the day, it was just a tragedy. The whole thing was just a tragedy.
When was the decision made to bring in an undercover police officer to try and catch him out? Because he posed as a gang member because apparently Sef was quite intrigued by telling people that he was in some kind of gang that, was called White Dragon Asians or something he'd made up, and that was a potential line of inquiry at some stage that this might have been a gang retaliation because he did mention it. But when was the decision made to bring in an undercover police officer to try and catch him out?
Well, it was simply a way of probing him to see whether he would react to that, which he didn't go all that well, but it was worth a try sort of thing. But I think the character I was looking for, the life that he led, was a Walter Mitty type of life. It's about this person who lives in a fantasy world and is very liberal with the truth, telling people all sorts of things that simply aren't true. And certainly in this case, and in any murder case, when you do come up someone who's a fantasist like that, among other things, you simply have to take the story and then tear it down. You have to follow up and make sure that what has been said is in fact not true, and then it helps the case obviously down the track.
What was interesting is that you said it wasn't overly successful, but it did give police some clues because what that undercover officer did was try and convince Sef to allow someone who was already in prison to take the rap for the murder. And so in doing that, he did provide them with plans of the layout of the house. And he did two things. He wrote with his own handwriting on it and wrote down the times of death of all three victims, something that police had not released, and they managed to match his handwriting to the graffiti on the wall. It's so interesting how they have to pull all these ties together, but still he did not admit to anything.
No, but I guess in a way it's still really, really damning evidence. My sense when I reflected back on it is that every time he opened his mouth, basically, he dug a deeper hole for himself. He was never going to survive this. But, I go back to the tragedy that it was and the impact it's had on the family and the community generally. I think was really shocked in this nice suburban street where on the face of it a lovely, loving family lived who were Christians and then these terrible things happened right in our midst. It was unfathomable.
Can we talk a little bit about his behaviour with money in the aftermath of the murders too? Because that can be quite telling. And this has been brought up in the case of the Menendez brothers too, in the murder of their parents, in that he attempted to access his inheritance as soon as possible.
Yeah.
He sold off a lot of his family's items so that he could get the money. He also got a victim of crime payout at one stage, which he used to make upgrades to his mum's car, which was an interesting choice. And then he also claimed to have a brain tumour and he asked a family member to give him $100,000 to pay for life-saving surgery. Behaviour like that, does that set off warning signals to investigators?
I think it proved, that for him not to realise that one of the things that the police would want to look at is what he does with money and the inheritance and seeking it immediately after the event. It's really dumb, actually, just dumb. And obviously the result was what he didn't want, which is that he was yet more nails in the coffin for him.
So he was eventually arrested. It's nearly a year later. With all of this evidence gathered together, police obviously figure they now have enough to actually put him in a courtroom. So at this point, they then take his fingerprints.
Yeah.
And this leads them to another discovery, which then kind of ties it back into this premeditated plan to kill them with poison that we've talked about already, because he'd been sending letters out to food manufacturers telling them that some of their food was contaminated, and that was a way he was going to try and tie it back
Cover
into
it
his
up.
family's death?
Yeah. Again, not smart at all. But the issue with the fingerprints is, my memory is that at the time he was charged, he had not been in trouble with the police before. Therefore, his fingerprints were not on record. But even if they were, we would have to take them again, obviously, because when you go before a jury, you can't bring up the fact that someone had been charged before and therefore we had their fingerprints on the file. So you have to do it in a way that does not disclose to a jury that this person has done something in the past, because it may influence their decision, obviously, their thoughts about the person. But again, just a really far-fetched, dumb move.
What was Sef like during the court proceedings? Did he at any stage look remorseful? Did he try to explain anything that had happened that sort of led police to further question things that he'd done? Like, what was his courtroom behaviour like?
I mean, I wasn't there, but it was discussed in the office and certainly with the investigators. I don't recall anyone saying he was remorseful. If he was, he would have pleaded guilty. And not that, there was a certain amount of arrogance and sort of haughty behaviour, thinking, I'm going to beat this, nothing's going to happen to me. And I think he's maintained that approach pretty much throughout. There's still no contrition, and I think the judge took that into account.
He even tried to access his inheritance to pay for lawyers, right? But ended up with a court-appointed lawyer in the end anyway.
He did, yeah. It's sort of shameless, really. It's the only word I can think of.
So he's obviously appealed the sentence that was handed down to him, and there's been attempts for special inquiries over many years, the most recent one being 2021.
Yeah.
Where is Sef Gonzales now in that process? Can he keep appealing? Can he potentially be released?
I think he's run out of options. I don't think legally, just in the normal system with appeals, he can appeal anymore. He's failed in his appeals. The only possible thing that might happen now is if the government of the day says, well, we're going to have an inquiry, but they would have to have a bloody good reason to do that, and it simply doesn't exist. My view is that, and as someone who's dealt with homicides for decades, it's a very strong case. It's an exceptionally strong case, overwhelming evidence, which is unable to be rebutted. So at the end of the day, he may get an inquiry, but I'd be gobsmacked if he did, because it would not be a rational decision.
What lessons do you think investigators might have learned from this case when investigating subsequent murder cases? Do you think there was a lesson in investigators from Sef Gonzales?
I mean, two lessons: tenacity, certainly not giving up, because there were some hurdles along the way, and he was never going to be cooperative or helpful or tell the truth in any way. But the second thing is that you can't sort of draw conclusions and reach a position early on. You must be methodical. You must be, thorough, absolutely thorough, and go through all the possibilities other than the person you suspect and rule them out one by one, which is what had to happen here. The idea of a gang, the idea of overseas people sending someone to kill them, the idea of a racist attack, the idea of a home invasion with robbery as a motive, all of those had to be ruled out logically and rationally with all the evidence available to make sure that the only option, as Sherlock Holmes used to say, when you rule out all the other improbable things, whatever's left has to be the answer. I mean, that was a torturous process and very long process. That's why it took 12 months or so for police to charge him, but they did everything right. They actually went through the steps, ruled everything out, so that when they went to court, they were on very solid ground.
Just finally, I'd love to know how cases like the Gonzalez murders impacts you personally, because you see the worst of the worst during your career. And when we find out what Sef did in that time, his sister Clodine died just after 4 p.m, his mum more than an hour later after she returned home from work, Dad sometime after that. So this wasn't one fit of rage and passion. This was over hours. And in between, he would have stopped, knowing what he's done, and then done it again. And then there's evidence that he took a shower afterwards, got himself ready, went out to dinner with a friend. explained away some other things about why the phone was busy. Maybe it was them using dial-up internet when people couldn't contact them at home. Like, he was really calm and collected. And that is terrifying to know that someone can do those things and then just walk back out into the world. How do you feel knowing people like that exist?
Certainly the impact on investigators is something that we've and as time has gone by, I think we're much better at recognising that and doing something about it. One of the things we brought in was mandatory sessions with the counselling. At least I think my memory was either 6 months or 12 months. They do see the worst of society, human beings at their worst. They also see sometimes people at their best, human beings at their best, doing the right thing, really taking risks to save others and so on. But the important thing is to recognise that it is something that has an impact on people, and therefore you must make sure that you have a framework in place that helps them, deal with it adequately with professional help. I spent 3 years as the chair of the Royal Commission into Defence and Military Suicide, as I said, and we did that for the staff there. I made sure that was implemented. And every 2 months, all of the staff had to have a session with the counsellors, and you had the same person all the way through, up to and including the 3 commissioners. We agreed that we would do that as well. So I guess while it's rough, and I must say in my experience, particularly if I had to go to a post-mortem of a child, it affected me a lot more than an adult. And I don't know why. I'm not a psychologist, but I have kids, most of us do, and for some reason post-mortems with children really affected me. But we recognised that, and we had things in place such as mandatory counselling sessions that helped us to get through all of that. And we did that also with the Royal Commission. But the other thing that is very important is obviously the feel in the office, if you like, of people being there for each other, looking out for the person sitting next to them. If they see signs of somebody who's struggling, actually saying something and saying, "Look, do you want to talk about it? Let's see what we can do to help," and so on. And I know in the police, and it's a hard thing to say, when people have had mental health issues because of all the badness that they've seen, even if they get better, it's still remembered by the colleagues. This is a person who has struggled. He or she is once had a breakdown. It doesn't quite go away. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it's a societal problem. It's not just in the uniformed services. It's across society. And I hope and pray that people take note of some of the stuff that came out of the Royal Commission to try and speak up more about this stuff and put their hand up if they're not well and get help rather than, the alternative.
In August 2004, the Gonzalez family home at 6 Collins Street, North Ryde, was finally sold for $800,000. But that wouldn't be the end of its controversial life. The agents who sold the property to the Lin family, devout Buddhists who'd originally hailed from Taiwan and who'd put down an $80,000 deposit to secure their new home, didn't tell them about its grisly past. The Lin family did not want to live in a home where 3 people had been brutally murdered, saying it would be haunted and would bring them misfortune. They asked to pull out of the deal, but the agents refused to refund their deposit, saying they had done nothing wrong. Those agents would be the first under New South Wales law to be fined for misleading behaviour in promoting the property for sale, and they had to pay out more than $20,000 in penalties. The home did eventually sell again in 2005 for $720,000 to Pat Olivio and her partner Jeremy Mumford, who knew its dark story. They told Women's Day in 2017 that they still get really annoyed when people constantly ask them about the house's history, saying that all happened before their time and that they've had nothing but a good feeling living there. To this day, though, true crime fanatics will still drive past the address just to see the exact place that Sef Gonzales decided to take the lives of his entire family. Thanks to Nick for telling us his story. True Crime Conversations is hosted by me, Claire Murphy. The producer is Tali Blackman, and we've had audio designed by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.